Hey folks, so the right-wing YouTube channel PragerU made a video supposedly addressing the question, who was Karl Marx? Now there's so many things in this video that are just wildly inaccurate and incorrect, I don't really know where to begin. But I'm going to go over just a few of the wildly inaccurate statements in this video.
And controls pretty much everything. This notion was widely discussed and debated in European intellectual circles during Marx's lifetime. But nothing much came of it until Vladimir Lenin took power in Russia in 1917.
Not much happened in relation to Marxism after Karl Marx's death until the Russian Revolution, they say. They say it was discussed in intellectual circles. Really? Really? How about the fact that progressive laws were passed all across Europe as Marxist-led movements and political parties demanded things like, 8-hour workdays and progressive legislation? How about the fact that in the United States, Marxists were key in the struggle to overturn slavery? I mean, Marxism, between Marx's death and the Russian Revolution, did all kinds of things. It was one of the biggest mass movements that had ever been seen, especially in Western Europe. Huge social democratic parties and labor parties were formed, unions were formed in factories. Later in the video, he goes on to point out that in the aftermath of Marx's life, the standard of living went up across Europe. And he seems to ignore that that was because there was a huge Marxist movement building labor unions, building progressive organizations, demanding people's rights, fighting against the bosses, and winning these things. He makes it sound like nobody believed in Marxism, no one thought about Marxism except they were talking about it in intellectual circles. Until the Russian Revolution. That is ridiculous. Until the Russian Revolution, the Marxist movement was biggest in Germany, actually. The German Social Democratic Party, led by Karl. There were figures like Edward Bernstein. All across Europe, there was a vast Marxist movement that was key in fighting for the right to vote, fighting for the rights of workers on the job, fighting for the rights of women. How in the world can he say that it was just kind of discussed in intellectual circles until 1917? That is just completely outrageous that he would even say that. He should be embarrassed. This man calls himself a professor of political science. Does he not know where one of the main political parties in Germany, the Social Democratic Party of Germany, originated? Has he never heard of the British Labour Party? Does he know where they came from? But nobody did anything about Marxism. Nobody. Not the Fabian Society, not the Chartist movement, not the labor movement. None of that. Nothing happened. Nothing. Nothing. They were just talking about it in intellectual circles until 1917. How does anyone take him seriously? Marxism was one of the biggest political movements Europe has ever seen, and it was very, very, very widespread and popular long before the Russian Revolution.
Wherever Marx's ideas were practiced, life got worse. Not by a little, but by a lot. There is not a single exception to this rule. Not the Soviet Union, not Eastern Europe, not China, not North Korea, not Vietnam, not Cuba, not Venezuela, not Bolivia, not Zimbabwe. Wherever Marxism goes, economic collapse, terror, and famine follow.
At the time of the Russian Revolution, Russia was a very, very impoverished country. It had an agrarian economy. Most of the country didn't have running water. Most of the country was illiterate, about 65% illiteracy. Most of the country did not have electricity. By 1936, the Soviet Union had become a world industrial power. They had electrified the entire country. They had provided every person with running water. They had wiped out illiteracy. They had universal employment. Villages that had been huts, where people were living in like primitive conditions, were replaced with modern housing units where everyone had running water and electricity. In 1936, just shortly after the Russian Revolution, just 2 decades after the Russian Revolution, the Soviet Union was producing more steel than any other country in the entire world. In 1936, the Soviet Union had the world's largest hydroelectrical power plant, the Dnieper Dam. The life expectancy vastly improved. The population, for the first time, had access to education. They had running water, they had electricity, they had access to medical care. But he says that it made life worse. You can criticize the Soviet Union all you want. There were problems there. We're not talking human rights here. We're just talking by objective measure. He says that it made life worse in the Soviet Union and everywhere else. Made life worse. Compare Russia in 1936, after it had fully industrialized with socialism and the 5-year plans of Stalin. Compare it to 1917. By no objective measure is that in any way the case. Living conditions had vastly improved. The standard of living had vastly risen. I mean, and this wasn't just something that communists were saying. Look at the Time magazine articles. Read the New York Times from that period. Read how even like right-wingers were going over there and marveling about it. The whole world was actually blown away by what the Soviet Union was achieving during the 1930s. So for him to say that it made life worse just shows that he's completely out of touch with reality. And he talks about China. You know, he says, oh, and it just made life worse in China too. Really? Really? Let's talk about China. In 1949, there was not a single steel mill in China. Today, half the steel in the entire world is produced in the state-run steel industry in China. The Chinese Communist Party has lifted 700 million people out of poverty. Today, the world tourism industry is having a boom because people whose ancestors, you know, parents and grandparents were peasants who were illiterate and malnourished are now going on vacation to New York City and Paris and London. I mean, the achievements of both the Russian Revolution in terms of making the Soviet Union into a world industrial superpower, the achievements of the Chinese Revolution are vast. How does this man say this with a straight face? I don't understand how someone can say such wildly inaccurate things. I mean, any economic textbook can show you what was achieved in both the Soviet Union and China. At the beginning of the 20th century, Russia and China were deeply poor countries. Today, Russia and China are global superpowers. China has the second largest economy in the world. I don't know how anyone can say this. I mean, this is just outrageous that he can even get away with this. You know, he talks about Cuba. Well, compare the way Cubans live to the way people live in Haiti or the Dominican Republic or other developing countries around the world. You can criticize these countries all you want, but to say that it made life worse, that's just wildly inaccurate. Nobody would say that Cubans' living conditions were better under Batista before 1959 than they are today. Nobody would say that. Nobody would say that. In no objective measure did the conditions get worse. In fact, the Cuban healthcare system is studied all over the world for its achievements. You know, I mean, unbelievable that he can get away with this. But let's get to another part of the video.
So, if cataclysmic failure, meaning terrible human suffering, is the inevitable legacy of Marxism, why do so many people, and now especially young people, defend it? The most common answer Marxism's advocates offer is that they, whoever they are, Lenin, Stalin, Chavez, never really practiced Marxism. They all somehow got it wrong.
Now, this is interesting because he's correct. Now, most people in the USA and in Western Europe who call themselves Marxists will do that. They'll just say, oh, it wasn't real socialism. And you know why that is? Because they're cowards. And because Marxism, the Marxist movement, at this point is largely tied to academia. If you are a Marxist, one of the places for you to get employment is at universities. And if you want to be a Marxist at a university, you can get a grant to write a book about white privilege. You can get a grant to write a book about transgender oppression. But if you write a book challenging the narrative regarding the history of the 20th century and the socialist countries, you're not going to get a grant to publish it, and they're not going to have anything to do with it. Why? Because the universities largely depend on grants and foundations provided by the Rockefellers and the Ford Foundation and lots of very, very well-funded capitalist institutions that do not want to hear this. They have no problem with the cultural side of Marxism. They think gay rights is great. They think that, you know, that women's liberation is great. They have no problem with, you know, the kind of cultural critique. But when you start defending alternatives to capitalism, they have a big problem with it. But I wanted to go on to another thing that he said in this video. This is another thing he says about Karl Marx.
Marx spent his days in the reading room of the British Museum, researching and writing. Although he was obsessed with the term scientific, he was never able to marshal data to prove his theories. There's a good reason for this. There was no data to prove his theories. For all his time in the library, Marx couldn't find any evidence to suggest that capitalism, the free exchange of goods and services through privately owned business, was a passing phase.
No data. Has this man ever opened the book Capital? Has he ever opened it? I mean, the book is full of statistics from the British Museum, statistics about the production of cotton, the production of steel, the production, all kinds of economic statistics throughout the book. It's a dense text. I mean, has this man ever even opened it? To say that Marx never relied on any data, I mean, what a lunatic. I mean, how does this man get away with saying these kind of things? I don't know how he gets away with this. No data. Really, open the book Capital. It's available. You can get it at most bookstores, most libraries. Open the book Capital and see if it has no data in it. I challenge you. The book is full of statistics.
Since few people give up their liberties and property voluntarily, Creating a Marxist state has always required guns, prisons, and summary executions. Marx's many disciples from Lenin on never considered this a problem.
Here we go again. Now, he insists that Marxists believe in violent revolution. Well, actually, if you'll look at how these Marxist revolutions have happened, it wasn't the Marxists who favored a violent revolution. For example, he talks about China, the Chinese Revolution. The communists wanted, at the end of the Second World War, to have a coalition government with the nationalists and the KMT and Chiang Kai-shek. They favored a coalition government. And the KMT, the Nationalist Party of China, which was aligned with the United States, would not allow the communists to participate in the elections. He says that communists don't believe that they can ever take power peacefully. In Chile, in 1973, Salvador Allende took power peacefully. He was elected. And the response was the CIA removing him. The United States backed Augusto Pinochet to be very, very violent. And the Venezuelan government, the Bolivarian government of Venezuela came to power peacefully. Chavez was elected in 1999, and he peacefully took power and in 2003 began moving the country towards socialism. In Bolivia, Evo Morales, the Marxist president, was elected peacefully. You know, actually reading the writings of Lenin, the writings of Stalin, the writings of, other leaders, you can see a strong critique of what they call left adventurism or punchism. Communists always favor peaceful means of taking power. However, the capitalists, in order to preserve their wealth, tend to be very, very violent and get rid of any democratic institution in order to preserve their power. So this notion that communists favor violence or violent revolution is simply false. If you look at it, in so many instances, you can see communists are the ones that are trying to peacefully transform the society, and then the capitalists are violent to them and they defend themselves. That's almost how every single revolution in the history of Marxism has gone down. Grove City College should be embarrassed to have this man as a professor. This man thinks nothing happened in relation to Marxism except intellectual circles discussed it between Marx's death in 1917. This man does not understand that vast living standard achievements took place in the Soviet Union, China, and other countries. This man does not understand that the Marxist movement has vastly debated and discussed the issue of rejecting left adventurism and punchism and favoring a peaceful transition to socialism. This man doesn't know any of that, and he calls himself a professor of political science. This man is teaching young people about Marxism when he has absolutely no understanding of Marxism himself. This man thinks that the book Capital does not have any statistics in it. Grove City College should be embarrassed to have this man on the faculty.